Record. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this platform. This is a beginning. This is the first session and hopefully a long session or series of lectures. So let me first of all welcome you wholeheartedly, and I hope you will go with us on this journey and meet all our speakers who are going to be genuinely from all over the globe. So this is not just a local series, it's truly a global series, whether it's the audience or the speakers, and I'm really thrilled to share this platform with you. So let me introduce the series very briefly. And the series title is Empowering Muslim Women in History, Literature, and Art. As you can see from the title, this is a multidisciplinary venture that's going to straddle many fields. So basically, what we share in all these fields is the representation of women. And obviously, Muslim women, Arab women have always been subject of representation, subject of controversial misrepresentation. And obviously, here in this platform, we'll try to debunk the stereotypes. We'll try to hear from the experts themselves and demystify whatever stereotypes are there, etc., etc. And so what will happen, we have a speaker today, we have another speaker next week on the 8th of December. And then we will resume our lectures after the Christmas break, and obviously we will contact you. Before we start, I would say if you would like us to add you to the mailing list regularly, please email us your name and email address, of course, and we will have you as a priority in the list of emails. So I think without further ado, I will pass on the screen to my colleague Hatoon, and she will introduce today's speaker, Hasnaa Mokhtar, whom I thank wholeheartedly for accepting and being brave to be the first. Thank you very much.
Yes, so hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum. We are really proud to launch this series, and we're very glad to have you within our first meeting. I would like to say a few words about Hasnaa, who is not only a scholar and academic, but she's also an activist and a journalist and a mother of two, and so many other things. So let me follow what how she wanted to be introduced. She's a postdoc associate at Rutgers University Center of Women's Global Leadership. She holds a PhD from Clark University on narrative power and the invisible trauma of gender violence in Kuwait. She's a scholar, researcher, and activist, even extra, with expertise on the Arabian Gulf. She's a Saudi, by the way, focusing on narratives of Muslim survivors of gender-based violence. After graduating in 2015 with an MA of International Development and Social Change, Hasnaa developed a passion for transdisciplinary approaches to address violence in Muslim communities. She concentrated on Kuwait as a starter, but then she expanded it to other communities. Her writings have been published in mainstream media such as Fortune and Yahoo, and in academic journals such as the Feminist Review and Feminist Anthropology. She previously served as the executive director of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions in Worcester, MA, and more recently as the special program director at Peaceful Families Project. She is sharing with us her website where you can find a lot more about Hasnaa and more about her writing and interviews. Hasnaa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to Dr. Zahia and Dr. Hatoon for their invitation. No pressure today. So, and I'm grateful to Dr. Hatoon for being my mentor for a few months now, and being having being an inspiring figure in my research and in my life. So thank you so much. Let me just share my screen and my, okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So today, the title of my presentation is The Women of the Arabian Gulf, Tokens of Modernity, Symbols of Piety, or Victims of Patriarchy. We'll start Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima aghlaq wal-Khatim lima sabaq nasir al-haqq bil-haqq wal-hadi ila siratika al-mustaqim. I'm gonna start the presentation with an excerpt from a poem by Sarah Labaid. I will go through the introduction quickly, situating the work, a word on speaking my truth, and why did I conduct the research I did, the problems and the gaps, theoretical and conceptual frameworks. Then I'm going to get to the coloniality of gender and gender narratives based on my research. So a note, this is based on a chapter in my dissertation, so please bear that in mind. I will do my best to make a 300 pages worth of writing coherent in 20 or 30 minutes. The reason why I conducted my research in Kuwait is that I received a Fulbright grant, and I established to do the research there in 2018 and 19. And I established contact with Abolish Article 153, Dr. Ayn al-Sharikh, who graciously supported my research at the time, as well as that Kuwait is a very unique historical history in terms of women's political participation. So all these reasons have intrigued me to kind of go there. And I'm so grateful for the connections that I've made and the people that I've met and the work that and the things that I've learned during my stay there. So I met Sarah in Kuwait when she was reciting a very powerful poem called Woman at the Gulf University for Science and Technology. And I wish I had more time today to include all the artists and the authors of Kuwait that I cite in my dissertation in the spirit of complicating and diversifying and transforming prevalent narratives about the Gulf region that I'm gonna address in a little bit. So this is part of her poem, Sarah, an ode to stories untold. So here's to all the untold narratives, to all the murders that never fought any battles. Here's to the heroines we don't get to read about in storybooks, those who took care of a whole nation when all the capable men were abroad sail ships, searching the depths of the ocean for pearls that were as beautiful as the eyes of the women they loved. Here's to those who changed the world every day without knowing it. Here's to the Palestinians who taught in Al-Madrasa al-Mubarakiyya during the 30s, and to the Egyptian teachers who were sent during the 50s when 83% of the of the population, was illiterate. Let us not forget where we came from. So thanks to Dr. Hatoon for introducing me earlier with all my identities. Being objective is not my goal in this work. I embrace my identities because they shape my experiences and how I see, interact, and understand the world. To me, objectivity in research is a delusion. Feminists insist that the personal is always political, which underscored the connections between personal experience and larger social and political structures. And borrowing from Roxane Gay's words, that we ought to know our privileges and to use that privilege for the greater good and to work for social justice. So navigating my dualistic positions and locations of being both a Saudi citizen and an American citizen, being a survivor of violence and an anti-violence advocate, being visibly Muslim because of the hijab and a non-Black middle-class Arab, being Khaliji or from the Gulf and a doctoral student in the Western Academy, being a cisgender woman and able-bodied has been a constant challenge throughout my doctoral journey. To remind myself of the privileges I have, the impressions that I have to address and grapple with. It is a privilege to have access to higher education and being in these spaces, but that did not deter me from calling out the staying power of coloniality within scholarship produced about the Arabian Gulf. I continue to resist assimilation to power-driven, self-serving institutional ways of knowing and research. Simultaneously, I was and continue to be committed to challenging the patriarchal status quo in my communities. A hard balance to strike sometimes, for sure. And a quick note on speaking my truth. I want to start with these words from Frederick Douglass, because with this research, I'm not after being part of the popular academic discourse or the mainstream. If my work inspires one person today, then I'm grateful, and that's how I try to continue to be true to my purpose. And he says, I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and to incur my own abhorrence. Now, my experiences in the research that I've conducted. So it is difficult to exist in this place in between. So I was born in the US, and then I grew up in Saudi Arabia, where my family is originally from. I experienced violence, interpersonal violence, institutional violence, spiritual violence, you name it. I've lost my faith, and I was in search for the truth. And I've confronted Muslim, Arab, conservative patriarchy in all its shapes and forms. The fact that you are taught a selective history within textbooks, and a selective religious narrative in textbooks, how this idea of a woman is constructed as she exists mainly for the pleasure, sexual demands to meet the sexual demands and be subordinate to her spouse or a man in the family, and all of that. And the countless times I felt like dehumanized, sexually objectified, and ill-treated within that context. And then I came to the US in 2013 and to continue my graduate studies. And it was really interesting to see how the Arabian Gulf was not always a subject of intellectual concern. And when it happened, the discussion took a top-down, state-focused, and economically motivated approach. Despite the complexity and the diversity of the region when it comes to class, ethnicity, tribal belonging, citizenship status, gender, race, you name it, white stream academia and the media, which is literature often produced in the English language, flattened, if not erased, this distinctness. And so existing in this place in between is very difficult. Speaking back to sexist Orientalism and to Islamic sexism. In fact, Kuwaiti Palestinian intersectional feminist Hennin Al-Ghabra wrote in her book and eloquently says that feminists like me struggle with, quote, the need to critique the oppression of women and other marginalized identities within our own communities due to patriarchy, and the need to protect our communities from the pervasive nature of white patriarchy. So what are the problems? There's a huge gender gap, no gender representation and analyses, gender which reflects gender structure and knowledge and masculine and patriarchal ways of thinking. The Euro-American centrism, which kind of utilizes a shallow and sometimes racist narratives in mainstream knowledge production systems, which in turn the voices and lived experiences and other social and relational dimensions are ignored. And then the gender-based violence narratives the problem itself becomes like an exception, that it's an exception to the region, although violence happens everywhere, and which kind of masks the problem, the complexity of the problem, and perpetuates structural violence. Just a simple example of these narratives and how they continue to be persistent in modern day English language. So on the left here, you have in 1917, the journal Neglected Arabia, which has been produced by American missionaries. And I didn't come to learn about this except for the book Gulf Women. You can see, like, this is a quote by a doctor that said, the east of which I want to tell you is in the Arab country of the Persian Gulf and of Muslims, yes. And there's somebody who has their mic and it just keeps making noises. If somebody can please, sorry, it's just distracting me. If you can mute yourself. Thank you. Polygamists 2,000 years behind the times in the march of civilization, a people backward and unprogressive, but backward because they have been under the sway and domination of the unthinkable Turk. All progress, ambition, and almost their very souls have been crushed out of them. And similar language, I've witnessed it over and over in my research again and again, coming up from both Westerners and from elitist within the local setting continue to use. And I will give an example shortly. This is the other quote in 2019. This is by an American associate professor, a white male who has been on a Fulbright, and he says the following within a meeting with an assistant secretary of the president at the time coming to visit. Kuwaitis are lazy, entitled, ignorant, and are far way behind. The US must use the soft powers to push for reforms in this region. Mind you, this person doesn't speak English. He's never been in Kuwait for less than, it was only like around 6 months. And when I asked him particularly why did he choose Kuwait to do his research as a scholar, he didn't have an answer for me at the time. And I was told by a lot of, by previous Fulbrighters that a lot of scholars kind of choose the region for, they get really good stipends by the Fulbright scholarship, the grant. Another example, but this is particularly as it pertains to the discourse around women. In 1904, again in the same journal, Neglected Arabia, this woman named Marian Wells Thomas, and she uses the initials MD, although she says in the story that she's not even a doctor, but she still kind of uses the title. This has been a really painful story of a Bahraini woman who has been taken to kind of get tested as the first patient in the hospital after it's been constructed. And there's been an invasion of her body, of like just trying to force her to take a bath. Like it's a very long story, but a very disturbing story of how somebody is constructed in the language as this kind of almost like animal, dehumanizing again description. And one of the parts here, I'm just going to read a short paragraph of the story. I thought a photograph of the first woman inpatient of the Mason Memorial Hospital would be interesting to our friends. And we tried to take one, but the only one we succeeded in obtaining can scarcely be reproduced. We tried to avoid exciting her in any way, her as in the woman patient, but she became suspicious of something and got her feet on the floor as if to flee at the first indication of danger. It is hard not to feel impatient with such ignorance and not to feel depressed at being so misunderstood. But we must take lessons from the patience of Christ and learn to have compassion upon the ignorant. Now, Huda Saadi, again in the book Gulf Women, she writes, and I quote, Arabian Gulf women are usually portrayed in traveler and missionary writings as uneducated, economically inactive, and oppressed in ways unknown in the West. The degraded condition of women and their low status became a metaphor for the decayedness and backwardness of the Gulf society as a whole. Notions of Western superiority were constructed on and around Gulf women, the primary symbol of social decay. They were seen as standing outside of history, shackled by unchanging social norms based on a conservative religion and traditional values, end quote. And while that's still prevalent, the issue here, the other quote that I use here is not actually, it's actually from a local upper class Kuwaiti woman. And the way this discourse have traveled and have been endorsed and kind of used to, again, locate issues of gender-based violence within kind of a less social class and less educated kind of communities in the country. And so this is what she says when I was discussing with her. The truth is we can abolish the law, which is the law that allows for a man to kill his wife and get away with murder, but they will still kill their wives because we have not taught them. We were not able to communicate with them. People who lived inside the Kuwaiti wall, their families traveled open, but these people aren't able to change, which impacts a woman when she wants to marry, study, work. What bothers me the most is our inability to reach those people. Now, the problem is not whether this is true or not. The problem is the way the language, again, this very classist and very kind of Orientalist narrative that kind of locates problems within certain specific people that come from specific backgrounds. And how this is persistent. In terms of the theoretical framework that informs the research that I did, I basically was inspired by the decolonial feminist movement, indigenous feminism and gender violence, and critical Muslim studies at the intersection of, and of course, Islamic feminism, at the intersection of critical development studies, Arab Gulf studies, and women's and gender studies. In terms of the conceptual framework, I look at the coloniality of gender, and I'm going to speak about this in a little bit. Structural violence outside the interpersonal violence, and researcher in the self, my relationship to the research, and kind of looking at indigenous paradigms and trying to understand sex difference originating in non-Western and anti-colonial contextual paradigms. Now, feminist philosopher and activist Maria Dugunos was the first in the decolonial movement to identify gender as being central to the conceptualization of the coloniality of power, as race was for decolonial thinkers, as something to be equally understood as a colonial construct. She put together the coloniality of power and intersectionality and came up with the colonial modern gender system as a colonial imposition that excluded women from newly created colonial public spheres. And with that, and her idea was that in order to understand the relationship, the changes that have occurred, we have to understand first, gender relations in pre-colonial societies. And we also have to understand that the racializing logic that Europeans impose and the colonized robbed non-Europeans, not only of their status as human, but also of the status as gender beings. Another piece of her argument is that it is important to think of collaborations in terms of white colonizers have constructed a powerful inside force with colonized men who are co-opted in patriarchal roles. And that can be also phrased as what what's his name? Hisham Sharabi coined as neo-patriarchy, in particular to the Middle Eastern context. And he says the neo-patriarchal discourse, whether in its religious or secular mode, including the nationalist and leftist variants, is necessarily delimited by the horizons of the dominant neo-patriarchal paradigm. The phenomenon of neo-patriarchy derives its meaning from the two terms or realities which make up its concrete structure: modernity and patriarchy. And based on all of this, I started seeing this pattern, and that's covered in different chapters in my book. First, there's this rescue missions and erasure of complexity and Euro-American centrism that tries to save the victimized Arabian woman from their oppression. And again, that's not just, as I said, is not just Euro-American centrism, it's also adopted by the state and a lot of the elites in the community. Protecting the piety of the Arabian woman, and that's kind of into the Islamic religious discourse in terms of the disciplining, attire policing, and male guardianship, which is changing, yet it still remains prevalent. And then tokenizing the Arabian woman with all these development visions that are happening and push for political modernization projects, women as being the champions of change in the face of progress. And in fact, in turn, and they mask state perpetuated and state endorsed structural violence, unfortunately. So for the saving of women, I want to just mention here quickly that Layla Abu Lughod in her book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving, she says that projects of saving other women depend on and reinforce a sense of superiority and on a form of arrogance that deserves to be challenged. All one needs to do, appreciate the patronizing equality of the rhetoric of saving women, is to imagine using it today in the United States about disadvantaged groups such as African Americans, Latina, or other working class of women. We now understand them to be suffering from structural violence. We have become politicized about race and class, but not about culture and gender. And another quote here that I want to, from Hayal Mughni's book, is that she says that, and even though it's been written in 2001, it's still valid to a certain extent, that two inaccurate accounts of women still persist. Quote, women have no freedom of choice in their most crucial life decisions. And second, that women's subordinate decision can be attributed to the power of Islam rather than economic, patriarchal, and political forces. And I add to that, this new emerging discourse about women as the champions of development and progress and modernization in the region. Now, to counter these narratives that I've just described, I want to share stories that emerged from the interviews that I've conducted. Stories of Sarah's grandmother, whose name is Sarah, another person's actually great-grandmothers, Al-Azam and Sheikha. And I do this because to escape the gaze of the Western eyes, as Elora Chaudhary writes in 2016, she says that situated knowledges and local voices must be recognized as legitimate sources of knowledge production. Recognizing women, feminists, and activists in their multiplicity, complicity, and agency can aid in dismantling hierarchical binaries. And so right now, I'm just gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna read about these stories, starting with a little bit of the poem that Sarah wrote and about her grandmother, Sarah. I was named after my great-grandmother. Her life story was a tragedy, but to me, it is a tale of heroism. It is the story of how one woman single-handedly raised a generation. I will not be able to share it the way my father has told it to me, with his eyes sparkling like sunshine on the surface of the ocean mid-July. With his animated hand gestures and the tone of his voice, it rose and fell in accordance, rose and fell like gloriously like an empire. When my father told me the story of his great-grandmother, he had all the exuberance of a little kid, with an exciting story to share, barely able to sit still. And I felt like he was waiting his whole life for me to ask about the woman I was named after. Sarah Jassim al-Fawzan, يا ماضٍ لم أشهده وحاضر أعيشه تاريخ الكويت بأكمله أنتِ يا مثالا أسمى لامرأة من الفولاذ يا بنت اللؤلؤ وبيوت الطين أنتِ يا مفخرة أجلى من نشيد وعلم يا عزا لم يقف عند حدود دولة. A historian estimated that she was born in 1905, before identifications and blue passports that some flail around like a free pass to racism. Like it's a pedestal that instantly puts them above others. Who told them that blue was the master of colors? She died in 1997, just 2 months after I was born, 2 months after she had held me for the first time. I don't know if her arms were warm. I don't know what she smelled like or the sound of her voice. And I grieve not her loss, but rather the loss of never having known her. That woman who had lost a father even before she was married at 15, bore 5 children, lost 3 of them, and her first grandson, all during her lifetime. It's a very long poem, so I will stop here, but she basically tells the story of the struggle of this woman and how Sarah, the person that wrote the poem, how she kind of looks at the strength of her grandmother and of her father's grandmother, and she derives her strength, and she's like a role model to her. The other story of I want to mention here is also of an artist and a fashion icon and activist who comes from the Bedouin community in Kuwait, and she's a Shia. And we started having a conversation, and I asked her to introduce herself and her role and discussion around women's rights and gender roles. And at one point, she started sharing the story of her maternal great-grandmother, whose nickname was Al-Azam. Al-Azam is an Arabic name derived from the roots of the word azam, which means to be resolute. Lulwa told me, Lulwa, which is like another true name, just this, I came up with these names to protect the confidentiality of the interviewers. Lulwa told me about how her great-grandmother, Al-Azam, lived her life and what she symbolized to the family. She says, if there was any conflict in the tribe, she resolved it. She possessed the strongest memory and knew where each family came from, who married whom. She was the wisest among the men. She died in 2018, and until every member of the family came to her resolve conflict, I used to see her as a role model. However, Al-Azam did not approve of Lulwa's public persona, her way of dressing or activism. She continues to explain. She hated that I go out, that I have a voice, that I write, I go on television, but I still loved her. She had an aura, a presence, a status, and eminence, but she wasn't feminine looking. She did not wear makeup. Her voice, her way of talking, she wore the zaboon, which is basically a traditional long dress made of silk and embroidered with gold threads with a narrow opening, like just a traditional dress, which is, there are certain male verbal codes she had to ascribe to. There's a protocol in her presence, no laughing, no joking. In her view, the man is always right, but she wouldn't do injustice against women. So Lulu explained that her grandmother did not approve of her because of how much she resembled her, like the similarity between her and her grandmother. And she continues to say, despite the conservative society, they were able to respect her. She gave me hope. And so after concluding like a lot of these interviews, there was a theme that was starting emerging, that there is presence for these very powerful and strong women who existed in these women's lives, in these Kuwaiti women's lives. And I couldn't stop thinking about Al-Azzam and Sheikha, and because my own grandmother, who actually got a divorce, lived alone and raised 2 young boys at the time. But unfortunately, when it was my turn to get a divorce and live on my own, she made my life a living here, my own grandmother, for wanting to do the same as she did. And again, there was another interviewee that I've spoken to who dedicated her master thesis about Islamic feminism to her grandmother, describing her as a strong Persian woman who instilled in me values of independence, generosity, and kindness towards others. Now, Sarah Lebaid's grandmother, Haya's grandmother, and my grandmother occupied the space, particularly in my dissertation, because of the crucial question that decolonial feminists have raised about the status of women in pre-colonial societies, as I mentioned earlier. And so a gendered understanding of pre-colonial societies is central to understanding the social structures that the processes constituting colonial modern Eurocentered capitalism imposed, is pivotal in understanding the extent and importance of the gender system in integrating communal relations, egalitarian relations, ritual thinking, collective decision-making, collective authority, and economies. And as it relates to understanding gender relations in the pre-oil and pre-colonial Arabian Gulf, I borrow a solid question right now that the Iranian historian Hasnaa Mokhtar raised in her remarkable work. And she says, how do we employ gender analytically so as to write history differently? To write history from which women are not absent and gender is not a missing category, one in which issues of gender and women are not an afterthoughts and appendixes. And this is very important because, as I mentioned, like the gender gap in English literature when it comes to the region, I mean, it's changing now because I see a wealth of emerging scholars from different Gulf countries are taking up on these issues, but we still have a lot of work to do, unfortunately. And so aside from these stories of these women and trying to complicate the narrative, again, I don't ascribe to this very romanticized idea that pre-colonial societies were egalitarian, that everything was perfect and violence only was a result of colonial influence. I don't ascribe to that. And this is why I mentioned how my grandmother has been a force that kind of opposed to my own independence, even though she has lived a life of her own, a life of her choices. But so having said that, there is evidence that women have had a different role, again, derived from these stories, but also from the work of Huda Saadi, for example. She states that in pre-oil Arabian Gulf society has been described as a women's society, at least for the period between June and October each year when all the able-bodied men were away from home pearl diving. There's also, not to mention that pearling income was that women became, she mentions that women became pearl divers to pay the debt left by a deceased husband, for example. Women even sold fish at higher market rates than their male counterparts, which made the last, there was a decision by the Dubai, for example, Legislative Council in 1931 to ban women from selling fish. And the men opposed that legislation because women sold basically fish at a higher rates than the men. Bedouin women also herded and milked animals, collected water, made dairy products, and collected firewood. And aside from the economy, Arabian Gulf women also participated in artistic expressions and activities. They recited poetry, sang, and danced in not all women's spaces or in seclusion, but alongside the men. For example, in an article that the Sikka magazine, which is a UAE-based magazine, it was published in 2020, Ghada al-Muhanna wrote a piece titled, "What Do You Know About the Women of Arabia?" And in it, there was a black and white photo of a 1919 Bedouin woman from the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and she was performing this traditional dance called the Daha. And she carried a sword in the picture and danced in front of a line of 9 men dressed in traditional thobes and black, you know, and she appearing to smile and clap for the woman's performance in the picture. And so the person who wrote the article, Ghada, she says, the woman that is dancing is actually performing, and it's something called hashi, and it's part of a dance called dah, in which the men line themselves in rows and start to clap while making loud noises, imitating an animal's voice. The purpose of this dance is to boost the confidence of the men that are going out to war. And when a woman enters the field with a sword, she is telling those men that not only is she stronger than them, but more importantly, that she is the final line of defense in case they lose in their war, and that she will be the protector of the land. This idea of women being the defenders of the land is not uncommon, end of quote. There's also the idea of the pre-oil Arabian Gulf being a matriarchal society that can be seen in the work of the travel writers Wilfred Thesiger, and in him saying that male kinship had been preceded by kinship through women only. Another thing, I'm just here just going, I'm gonna give brief examples. There's a lot to be said, but as I said, I can't jam everything in one chapter in a 30-minute discussion. An important point to bring out is that a lot of the same-sexual relations that are punishable in most of the countries right now were a normal part of pre-colonial societies, as the researcher says. Here's, and I quote, Dalcora in 2014, she writes that same-sex relations were widely practiced across Middle Eastern societies for many centuries, and specifically to the Gulf. As'ad Abu Khalil indicates in his writings that laws to behead LGBTQI plus people, for example, were inherited from the principles of English Protestants of the late 17th and 16th and 17th centuries. So he writes, what passes in present day Saudi Arabia, for example, as sexual conservatism is due more to Victorian Puritanism than into Islamic mores. It is quite inaccurate to attribute prevailing sexual mores in present day Arab society to Islam. Originally, Islam did not have the same harsh biblical judgment about homosexuality as Christianity. Homophobia as an ideology of hostility toward people who are gay or was produced by the Christian West. Homophobic influence in Arab cultures was relatively new, and many were introduced from Western sources. In the Kuwaiti context, in particular, Alia Shahib did a study about homosexual behavior indigenous to Arab Gulf countries, and and the work reveals a little, a bit about the fact that same-sex relationships were native to the lives of Kuwaiti mariners from previous generations. And I quote, so what I'm trying to say here is that, again, I'm not ascribing to the idea that there has been perfect egalitarian, free societies, pre-colonial, pre-oil influence. However, the little that I have just shared, the snippets that I've shared today, whether from the stories of the women or from the research that have been, the little research that have been done, is that there is evidence that the formation of states within the region, backed by the colonial influence, the writing of the missionaries, and this push towards the modernization and progressive of the economic boost or whatever, all these projects have definitely created a shift in the way gender relations create, and the presence of women as well, and their participation. Well, now we argue that more opportunities have been given to women, whether in the level of education and the workforce. I would say that have kind of, again, it's like whose narrative and to which agenda, whether it's state endorsed and promoted for specific goals that are purely economic. And at the same time, it masks a lot of the structural violence that continues to impact a lot of women who come from at the intersection of different forms of violence, whether it's citizenship status, whether it's gender identity, whether it's religious minority, et cetera, tribal belonging, et cetera. And I just want to conclude here by, again, wrapping this discussion up by saying that the relationship between the global expansion of capitalist patriarchy and the escalation of gender violence is a fact that a lot of post-colonial, decolonial scholars have proven. But in Kuwait, particularly, I quote here, processes of urban high modernism have gone hand in hand with state control of population, reification and opposition of modern, i.e. Western-oriented consumerist and traditional identities and class hierarchies, consumerism and privatization. And so what I want to conclude by saying, the generations of our grandmothers and their mothers had strong women who might have resisted and at the same time assimilated to patriarchy in different roles and in multiple ways. History is never simple, flawless, or transparent. Scholars attempt to counter the popular narratives about women in the Arabian Gulf prove that matriarchal communities might have existed within the pre-oil and pre-colonial Kuwait and the rest of the region. But I don't believe in pertaining a rosy picture of our ancestors. As a feminist and a survivor of violence and a human being as well, my life is living proof that nothing is linear or consistent about how I came to know of my feminism and how I embraced it and how I rejected it and how I eventually found my calling. Despite this complexity, it is astonishing how structures of power mutate and reconstruct connections across the globe to further injustice against women. How things at the present moment and for tomorrow's future, that these pushes for modernization development might have worsened conditions for certain types of women in Kuwait and the Arabian Gulf and exacerbated violence. And I'll end with this quote from Naqib's book on Kuwait, Kuwait Transformed. Today's realities expose the failure of oil-driven modernization to achieve the utopian vision in which everyone at the time, citizens included, believed that oil would make Kuwait the best planned, most socially progressive and happiest state in the Middle East. By ignoring the essential features of the functioning social order in favor of grand foreign plans to create a new life, Kuwait's oil era modernization became another one of the many well-intentioned schemes to improve the human condition that tragically failed in the 20th century. Thank you so much for listening. I hope whatever I said made sense, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Hasnaa.
Thank you very much.
This is so illuminating. I will let Hatoon.
Hasnaa, thank you very much. This was a fascinating presentation. We didn't want to stop you from continuing. And I will not actually say anything about my comments or how I wanted to intervene with you. I'll leave it to the audience, whom I think have a lot to add and to ask you about. Please, whoever is interested in asking a question, raise a hand. We have Alejandra Galino. Alejandra, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourself. And whoever wants to ask, raise your hand.
No, sorry. No, I just was clapping, saying thanks to Hasnaa. It was very, very enriching to hear her. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Any question, any intervention?
If I may.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Hasnaa. I think this is so illuminating, stereotype breaking, and really so many versions of her story that the world doesn't know. The world doesn't know that Gulf women actually dived or went to war or led families, or the Gulf society being matriarchal. This is all news to me personally. And I've learned so much. And these narratives that you have collected are invaluable in really passing on firsthand stories and testimonies to us. And we need a lot of those, actually. So I personally learned so much. Thank you very much for that. I'm not asking questions. I just wanted to highlight these things. And I would let the audience ask questions.
I second that, Zahia. Okay, Isra, اتفضلي. Isra.
Much, Hasnaa, for such a lovely presentation, and congratulations on the postdoc. I just found out through this event. I honestly have a lot of questions that are also in relation to my own research, because I'm in that stage where I'm working on my theoretical framework. So I'm curious, you use Lugonis' work on coloniality of gender, and you do make a case for it, even though you You mentioned that you are not trying to insinuate that colonialism is the result, is what's caused all of this, gender inequality in the region. But how do you rationalize using her framework, and why did you decide to use Lugones and, for example, not some post-colonial feminists or other, third world feminists in general? So why Lugones specifically?
Thank you, Isra. I honestly, I used her work because, when I ascribe to the development, international development, schools, and that's been my training since I started my master's degree. And in that, discussions of development have always excluded the Gulf region because they're based on oil economy, which is the rentier state, and that it's a different theory that informs the region. So, and that was a problem because to me, it's like, I don't see the difference. And again, the rentier state theory is kind of embedded in the same masculinist state-focused idea, that, while I understand it, I don't see how it masks the gender dynamics of things. And this push from a lot of the states to kind of embody the visions of development and kind of push forward and include women in that. So that's number one. Number two, to me, this is, and I elaborate on that in my dissertation, it's not just a matter of taking decolonial feminists and trying to push it in the region, but the decolonization movement in general kind of gave me the option of trying to do something different that is true to my own work. I had a problem with predetermined feminist frameworks that I tell you, you need to look at this or look at that, and the disciplines and the methodologies. So I wanted to kind of be flexible. I wanted to see what emerges, from the research that I conduct. I took the framework, and as I said, like, while I discovered that there's been some evidence, I didn't ascribe to this idea that we paint a very rosy picture of that everything was hunky-dory before the influence of colonialism. The third reason is that nobody looks at the region as being colonized because there was no military occupation present. And that's one thing that the decolonial movement distinguishes between colonialism and coloniality. Colonialism is the actual presence of, officers, and they take over the land. But coloniality is basically what the missionaries have done, is using institutions like education, like the health sector, and introducing all these ideas about who's deemed to be worthy of, of whose knowledge is deemed to be worthy. Issues of race, like your husband has done a great work in this field, and he's been inspirational and validating a lot of the things that I was thinking about. There is this sense of a specific language and a specific agenda that is preserved to the region that kind of makes it an exception aside from everyone else. And so Maria Lugones' work inspired me, to be honest, since she's the one who came up with the coloniality of gender. She's the one who established that framework. It gave me tools to work with and see what came up with the research. And number three, it also gave me the opportunity to look at and reframe gender-based violence outside what is usually, constructed. So I used the work of Dr. Aziz Al-Hibri, for example, and Dr. Zainab Alwani, and trying to reimagine what gender-based violence looks like within a Muslim worldview that is outside, the academic research. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but and I hope that I answered it sufficiently.
Thank you, Hasnaa. Arij Al-Shamari, تفضلي.
And powerful presentation. Thank you so much, Hasnaa. I guess my question revolves more around your personal experiences and kind of doing this work in relation to, did you feel like there was resistance to what you were proposing or the arguments that you were making, considering, and this is from my own kind of take on the literature, specifically on women in the Arab Gulf, and where it is dominantly situated within this liberal feminist, white feminist kind of framework, right? And understanding that this this kind of decolonial, anti-colonial approach is only emerging. So how was that for you personally, and I guess within the spaces that are highly occupied by elite kinds of perspectives to gender in the Gulf? How was that, how was your experience with that?
Oh my God, thank you. First of all, it's good to see you, Arij, here, and thank you for coming. And second of all, Arij is a good friend of mine and an inspiration. So yeah. Yeah, it's violence within the academy. And one thing that I say that unless we address violence within academia, we cannot address violence outside of academia and the social structures that we critique and write about. And so, yes, it has been very difficult, whether you are presenting to a predominantly white audience. They think they know about the Gulf, with expertise about the Gulf, and you're trying to say, no, that's not what it is. That's not how it is. And then, the pushback that you receive within even sometimes, unfortunately, people from the region themselves and doing research on the Gulf and I'm trying to say there's a different way of doing things, and I got a pushback as well. But, and I started my presentation with saying that I don't want to be part of the mainstream. I don't want to be considered. And some people even told me that your research is too ambitious, as a way of trying to put me down, like I'm taking up this project that is unachievable in this lifetime. And I don't care, to be honest, frankly, because if one person is influenced or inspired by the work I do, I'm grateful for that. However, it's not easy. It's not easy. You have to speak to the white stream liberal gaze, and you have to speak to the local, manifestations of what that looks like as well. And it gets exhausting sometimes. You have to defend your existence. You have to defend your own work. You have to say, listen, I'm not speaking on behalf of everybody else here. I can't speak, and I write about this in another article. I say, just because I'm a Saudi, I don't speak on behalf of every Saudi. Just because I am from the Gulf, I don't speak on behalf of everybody in the Gulf. But the point is that you have to listen when I come to you and say, my experience as a woman and the experiences that I've heard and they share with me tell me otherwise than when your racist and your selective account is saying. So can you please pause and allow for room for multiple truths? This crazy idea that academia pushes us for, like, the truth. What is the truth? There are multiple truths can coexist, multiplicity, let's allow for that. Let's normalize that. And this war of disciplines as well. So my critique is not just of the literature itself, but of the way we produce knowledge, overall and in general. So I hope that, I'm sorry that you're experiencing the same, and, we need, and thanks to Dr. Zahia and Dr. Hatoon for allowing the space to have these conversations.
Thank you, Hasnaa. I think looking at the chat, there are some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So I will start with Iman Mazouz. Do you want to ask a question, Iman, or do you want me to read it?
Amal
Mazouz.
Hi, it's all right. Then I can just read it for her.
Go ahead.
I'm researching.
I'll come back to you, Nabila. Huh?
Thank you. Sorry. First, I want to thank you for the presentation. It was very nice and interesting, and has to do a lot with my research, because I researched the representation of Muslim women in Western travel writing. So I had a huge problem with objectivity, because when I did my first RD1, it was like, one of the questions was like, how do you distance yourself from your research, because you're a Muslim woman and you're researching Muslim women representations. And it was actually, I think it was my fault, because I got too excited, I guess, and I just started got too involved in my research, I guess. So but after I heard your presentation, I realized that it could be a plus, so it could be something to use, yeah. So how do I use that to my advantage? And if I ever get a question like that again, how do I explain it, or how do I defend myself in that?
Thank you so much, Amal, for your question. I mean, autoethnography, which is like a form of writing that has emerged recently, is something that you can utilize that counters this idea of objective research that allows for the researcher to use their personal stories as part of the research, and look into a lot of decolonizing research methodologies, like decolonizing methodologies by Linda Smith. She writes a lot about this. There's a lot of decolonial literature, feminist literature, that, you know, that negates a lot of this colonial ideas of conducting research, that it has to be objective, rational, that it has, and masculinist and patriarchal ideas about conducting research, that it has to be devoted. There is room for that for certain types of researchers, you know, and projects. But when it comes to the work that we do, I think, you know, it's good to embrace. So yeah, look up autoethnography. There's a book called Evocative Autoethnography. It's very helpful in that sense. I can't remember the name of the authors, but also look at decolonizing methodologies by Linda Smith and other decolonial feminist movements. I'm happy to email you if you like share your email.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Annie Zonfeld, and then Nabila. Okay.
Yes, hi, thank you. This was very interesting. I wanted to share with everyone actually a concrete example of what Hasnaa gave in regards to LGBT and the colonialism, and how the Muslim world has actually subscribed to the puritanical Christianity as quote unquote Islam. And so what we did, I do a lot of work at the United Nations, but I should also introduce myself. I'm Annie Zonfeld. I'm born and raised Muslim, originally from Malaysia, and people get confused about my last name and that they assume I'm not Muslim, but I am Muslim. And so the work that I do at the United Nations is definitely to counter a lot of what you were saying, Hasnaa, but in a real policy way. And so what we did was, Theresa May, the ex-Prime Minister of England, apologized actually for their legislation in the colonized countries and how they've implemented this very homophobic laws, and how this until today has affected human rights issues in the colonized societies. And so what we did was we took that and we organized a panel at the United Nations, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and brought in experts, religious and also community and indigenous people, to explain their society pre-colonialism. And it was very interesting, for example, how Nepal was never colonized, but India was. And even in these two Hindu states, how different their attitudes were towards homosexuality. And so that was a way for us to inform, not just to the West, but and to educate policymakers, but it was also to inform the Muslim majority countries, because as you can imagine, we get a lot of pushback from the diplomats, from particularly from Arab states, that accuse us of being an American tool, et cetera, et cetera. And so my easy push is, hang on a second, pre-colonialism, did you have, homophobic laws in place, et cetera? And to that point, they had to kind of like sit back and reflect a little bit. And basically, I just go on the offensive. And I said, well, if anything, you are the one that are perpetuating a Christian puritanical agenda, not us. So I just wanted to share that as a concrete example of how we operate in the policy space. Thanks.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, we'll give Nabila the last question. Running out of time, please, Nabila. Unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating and so inspiring. I feel touched listening to all of that. I am, of course, a visible Muslim woman. I do wear my hijab when I'm outside, and I have just recently come into the academic world as well. And in this field, in this daunting field, trying to represent my voice and Muslim women's voice in history, especially colonial history. Trace, I just wanted to in your research, I was wondering, in tracing Arab and Muslim women's narratives and their understandings of their positions within Islam, because women have, through colonial, post-colonial and contemporary society, understood their positions within Islamic theology, and they have used that in their reactions to colonial oppression and nationalist, conservative, patriarchal oppression, which bases, it bases itself on a misconstruction of Islamic scripture, as you suggested earlier on in your presentation, what tends to happen is a selective reading of scripture. Would you argue that Muslim women have generally accepted gendered ways of living? For instance, in Islamic feminist scholarship, there are two sort of discourses. One that argues for equality within the public sphere, but gender complementarity within the private sphere and the home. And then there is another discourse that I'm very early on in my research, but that I've encountered, which attacks this and is for a reinterpretation of Islamic scripture and sort of asking for women's representations in the public sphere, including mosque rituals. I just wanted to ask really how you feel Muslim and Arab women through this history have understood their rights in this context. Have they understood it in a gendered construction? And how, if you are proposing that in this day and age, how would you defend that?
Thank you so much, Nabila, for your question, and good luck with your research. I mean, that's a very big question to answer. What I can share is my personal experience again, so I worked as a journalist in Saudi Arabia and Arab news, and I wrote about women's stories, and I wrote about migrant workers' exploitation. And I didn't have my feminist vocabulary at the time. I only had my own personal experiences. So I knew that was wrong, I didn't know what oppression meant. I didn't know what victim blaming meant. I didn't know what, structural violence meant at the time. But your lived experience, it made me angry. It made me angry at the things that I was experiencing, whether it's male guardianship, whether it's, seeing that, domestic workers, how they get treated, seeing how, I can't even have a voice in my own decisions of my life, et cetera, et cetera. So the response is sometimes it gets tricky when we start to use language of feminism, because it means different things to different people. And that's what the decolonial feminists were saying, that we need to look at the lived experiences of people and allow for certain things to emerge. I'll give you a very simple example in my work in Kuwait. So one time I was teaching a course before going there to my students about gender-based violence in the global South. And I used this, there's this very popular Emirati social media person. And I used a clip where he takes his wife and they go to this restaurant in UAE and they sit on the floor and they eat together from the same plate. And I said, why shouldn't this be a form we can understand gender relations, a man and a woman eating from the same plate? Because he was talking about how this becomes a bond in their relationship. Mm-hmm. A few months later, when I went to Kuwait, I was interviewing this woman who identified as Bedouin. And she was saying that she was very upset at the liberal movement of feminism, saying that they need to pay attention to other forms of feminist resistance. And she told me that in her family, there is this tradition where women, when they serve the food for the men, they leave and the men have to eat first. And then after that, the women sit behind and they eat after them. And she said there's a woman in her family who kind of resisted this form by she refused to sit. She took her plate, she stood in the kitchen and she just ate by herself. And she's like, that was her victory, her small victory at the time. But yet you don't hear these stories being shared within feminist circles, because that's not what we think about when we think about resistance and, calling for your rights or whatever. So that's just a very small answer to a very big question, and saying that people might be resisting in different ways. But again, one thing that I want to add is that I always say that it's not a women versus men. It's patriarchy versus everything else, because patriarchy can be embodied by women as much as they can be embodied by men and other forms, other genders of people. So thank you.
True.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful.
I think there's no room even for our comments, Zahia.
No, I will just announce next week's lecture, but before that, I think I wholeheartedly thank you, Hasnaa, and all of you who made this evening happen. This is really a beautiful Women and Gender Forum, and I hope we will take it very far and cultivate relations between us. And who knows, maybe one day we will meet in the real world. The next week's lecture is going to be given by a white man white Western Scottish man from Glasgow University. We give him the opportunity to give us his view on hijab, the veil, between empowerment and disempowerment. It's really good to hear these alternative views and see what we can learn from them. So
this is a book by him, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
This is a book that he has just published, isn't it?
He just, this is part of the book. Obviously, next week we will present him and present the book that he's just completed and his work. He worked also on Sufi women, etc., etc. A lot of work. And personally, I look forward to listen to him and see what he has to tell us. So thank you very much indeed. And hope to see you next week, and take care.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your emails with us. Inshallah, you'll be on our mailing list, and you'll be first to know what's going on here. Thank you all for sharing this opportunity with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.